We are back for week 11 of our study of Acts of the Apostles. When last we left our hero, I always feel like I should start that way when we get into the part about Paul, because so much keeps happening. And we have seen him return to Jerusalem amid great warnings of bad things happening, put it that way. And bad things happen. He's nearly pulled to pieces by the mob before the Romans rescue him, intending then to interrogate him by flogging. He's just narrowly escapes that by revealing his Roman citizenship. He gives a speech in front of the mob explaining who he is and how he became Paul, the apostle. And of course, though they listened for a while, the mob rises up and can't get any sense out of them, wouldn't listen to anything he said. And we begin today in Acts 22, verse 30. The next day, the tribune, Claudius Lysias, not a name that really one says very often, he decides that if he's going to find out at all why this all started, he has to meet with the Sanhedrin, the Jewish council of priests and the Pharisees, Sadducees, all of these different parties who come together and create the leadership of the Jewish community. So he takes Paul, sets him before them, and if he was expecting to get, should we say, a reason that would stand up in a court of Roman law, he must have been terribly disappointed. Because Paul begins by saying, "Brothers, I have lived my life before God in all good conscience up to this day." And that's as far as he gets before the high priest Ananias, that says, you standing by him, hit him in the mouth. Like, okay. And Paul's very quick comeback is, God is going to strike you, you whitewashed wall. Are you sitting to judge me according to the law? And yet, contrary to the law, you order me to be struck. The one thing I take away from that is, you don't mess around legally with someone who has been trained in law. Remember, he was one of them. He, in fact, was trained by one of their most respected, even though he was a minority opinion, but he was a highly respected teacher of the law, Gamaliel. So he knows how these trials are supposed to go. But the others who are standing by it is like, are you reviling God's high priest? Paul didn't recognize him. And there's a lot of speculation as to why he didn't recognize him. Maybe he had just been away from Jerusalem for so long. And, over time, people change. It could have been, some say, that it was poor eyesight, that he couldn't see that far, that clearly, and didn't realize who had said it. I've even heard it said that Ananias' behavior made him unrecognizable as high priest. Because indeed, he had ordered injustice in the court. And when Paul says something like whitewashed wall, there's a couple places he might be drawing that metaphor from. Of course, we've been introduced to Jesus using that term. If you want to look back at Matthew 23:27, where he says that the Pharisees and Scribes are like whitewashed tombs, very pretty on the outside, but inside full of all kinds of dead man's bones and uncleanness. But there's also a section in Ezekiel, chapter 13, where the prophet Ezekiel condemns false prophets who have told the disobedient people of God that they will have peace when their disobedience has brought them anything but. And there, he's like, the people build the wall, basically, they do things, and the prophets smear it with whitewash. Basically saying, what the people do, the prophets make look right, but what the whole role of a prophet is to reveal sin so that it can be confronted and repented of. Yet these false prophets have made evil good and good evil. And what Ezekiel says that God says to these prophets is, say to those who smear it with whitewash that it shall fall. There will be a deluge of rain, and you, O great hailstones, will fall, and a stormy wind break out. When the wall falls, will it not be said to you, where is the coating with which you smeared it? Basically, it's like, you said this was okay. So why has this happened? It could have been that that's what Paul had in mind when he is talking to a high priest who commits injustice openly, flagrantly in court, and calls it justice. So we've already started, and it must have been great to the disappointment of Claudius Lysias, where rather than a, shall we say, reasoned judicial proceeding, we have already fallen to injustice, insults, and just flat out, it's almost like a farce here. And it doesn't get better, because Paul decides he's going, I believe the phrase is, he's going to throw a cat among the pigeons. He sees that, part of it is Sadducees and part of the group is Pharisees. And so he says, brothers, I'm a Pharisee, son of Pharisees, and it is with respect to the hope and the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial. This was not what the Romans wanted to know about why he was nearly killed by a mob. But it works in a way. When he said this, a dissension arose between the Pharisees and the Sadducees, and the assembly was divided. We've already been introduced to the Sadducees and their complete lack of belief in anything really spiritual. When they came and asked Jesus the rather ridiculous question, there were 7 brothers and one had a wife, and he died without children, and so the second brother took her as wife and he died, and so on and so forth through all 7 of them. And then at the resurrection, whose wife will she be? And of course, Jesus' response was, you don't know what you're talking about. First off, at the resurrection, people will be different than they are now. And second, that there is a resurrection. God is referred to as the God of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And as he's not the God of the dead, they must be alive to him. And so these are the sort of people now that form half of the conflict. The other half, of course, are the Pharisees, And they begin to say, we find nothing wrong in this man. What if a spirit or an angel spoke to him? This is quite the interesting about turn. But one thing, whenever Paul is involved, it just seems like whether it's a mob attack or infighting between two parties, he's always the one in danger. The disagreement between the two factions becomes so violent that the tribune becomes afraid that Paul is going to be pulled apart by them. So he has to take him away from among them by force and bring him back into the safety of the barracks. What a farce. It is just a joke that this was some kind of legal proceeding. But there's a little interlude, one verse. During the night, Paul has a vision. The Lord stands by him and says, "Take courage. For as you have testified to the facts about me in Jerusalem, so you must testify also in Rome." Now, there's something about this. This phrase, "you must testify also in Rome." I wouldn't be surprised if Paul construed it as, I won't let anything happen to you here because I have work for you to do in Rome. Which is a good reassurance to have in light of what happens next. In the morning, certain among the Jews made a plot and bound themselves by an oath neither to eat nor drink till they had killed Paul. And there were more than 40 who entered into this conspiracy together. And so they pull the chief priests and the elders into collusion with themselves, saying, "We have taken this oath, so you send to the tribune to have him bring Paul before you again, as if you were going to determine his case more exactly." Now, if the last hearing had been a judicial farce, this one is an out-and-out lie. I have no interest in justice or in even the appearance of justice. This is a lie to draw Paul out into the open so that he could be killed. However, deliverance comes from strange places. We find that Paul has a sister, and that sister has a son. And that son is in a position to learn about the conspiracy. Not only that, but that he gathers up his courage to go to the barracks and speak to Paul. Now, it's not unusual that Paul, his family, since he had once been a Pharisee and his father apparently was a Pharisee, that they would be in contact with this community. What is unusual, and it makes me wonder, I'll never know the answer to this, whether or not Paul's family had heard and accepted the gospel or not, or whether this was just a lingering loyalty to blood relation. Whatever the answer to that is, Paul gets to hear of the conspiracy, so he sends his nephew to by one of the centurions to go to the tribune and explain it to him. So we've had the plot. Now we've had the nephew involved. And the nephew goes to the tribune and tells him and warns him, mind you. You have to think about this. If he's going to be escorted to the Sanhedrin by Romans, the odds of only Paul being killed are not very high. Because obviously, what happens if you lose your prisoner when you're a Roman soldier? You lose your life. So the tribune takes this very seriously. They are trying to steal one of Rome's prisoners and murder him. So he decides on quick, decisive action. He sends the young man away and says, don't tell anyone you said this. You right? For all they know, you just came to bring your Uncle Paul a little basket of food or something, to make his stay in prison easier. So he sends the nephew away, and he summons 2 centurions and says, get 200 soldiers, 70 horsemen, 200 spearmen to go as far as Caesarea at the 3rd hour of the night. Got 2 things going on here. Now, if, as it is thought in historical records, that in and around the Jerusalem area were stationed about 1,000 soldiers, he has just summoned up 470 of them. That's almost half of his available fighting force to accompany Paul to the coast, to the governor's protection. And he is also going by night. And I'm assuming this would be even before the fake request came in for Paul to come before the Sanhedrin again. So he's not going to give them any chance to put their plot into action. He is going to bring his prisoner safely to a stronghold beyond, basically beyond the reach of the Jerusalem factions. And he writes a letter. This letter that he writes is a triumph of what we call today spin. Claudius Lysias, to His Excellency the Governor Felix, greetings. This man was seized by the Jews and was about to be killed by them when I came upon them with the soldiers and rescued him, having learned that he was a Roman citizen. Now we know he's glossing over quite a lot, like the fact that he almost flogged this Roman citizen because he didn't know he was a Roman citizen. But it sounds so much nicer when you say, I learned he was a Roman citizen, so I swooped in and I rescued him. Some things never change. And the letter goes on, desiring to know the charge for which they were accusing him, I brought him down to their council, and I found he was being accused about questions of their law, but charged with nothing deserving death or imprisonment. And when it was disclosed to me that there would be a plot against the man, I sent him to you at once, ordering his accusers also to state before you what they have against him. It's a lovely way of saying, I wash my hands of this mess. Tag, you're it. So they take Paul and the letter, and they ride through the night to Caesarea. And he ends up guarded in the governor's own residence, known as Herod's Praetorium. Quite an active few days for Paul. And also for his opponents. Because it says, after 5 days, and many people have wondered whatever happened to those more than 40 men who took that vow. But I have read in certain places that there were provisions made in the rabbinical tradition for if a vow became impossible to carry out, that you were forgiven and didn't have to complete the terms of it. So they could, start eating and drinking again. But 5 days later, a party from the Sanhedrin, headed by the high priest Ananias and accompanied by what looks like a lawyer, possibly even a Gentile lawyer, who would know their way around Roman politics, should we say. And they come to lay their case against Paul before the governor. The contrast between the speech of the accusations, the should we say, the prosecuting party, and Paul's defense is fairly stark. You have this lawyer, Tertullus, basically lying and laying it on thick by saying, since through you we enjoy much peace, Felix's term as governor was anything but peaceful. And since by your foresight, most excellent Felix, reforms are being made for this nation, he was also considered one of the most incompetent governors of that region. And the Jews hated him, absolutely hated him. But to get in good with the judge, sometimes you have to whitewash things a little bit, shall we say. So after this flowery and totally untrue beginning, he says, to detain you no further, I beg you in your kindness to hear us briefly. For we have found this man a plague. Nice, thanks. One who stirs up riots among all the Jews throughout the world and is a ringleader of the sect of the Nazarenes. He even tried to profane the temple, but we seized him. By examining him yourself, you will be able to find out from him everything of which we accuse him. Really? And you can, I just have this mental picture of the Jews in the background going, because, it says the Jews also joined in the charge, affirming all these things were so. And here's Paul's defense. Knowing that for many years you have been a judge over this nation, I cheerfully make my defense. Well, it is at least honest, right? You can verify that it's not more than 12 days since I went up to worship in Jerusalem. They did not find me disputing with anyone or stirring up a crowd, either in the temple or in the synagogues or in the city. Neither can they prove to you what they now bring up against me. But this I can confess to you, that according to the way, which they call a sect, I worship the God of our fathers, believing everything laid down by the law and written in the prophets, having a hope in God, which these men themselves accept, that there will be a resurrection of both the just and the unjust. So I always take pains to have a clear conscience toward both God and man. Now here's where he comes down to, this is what really happened. After several years, I came to bring alms to my nation and to present offerings. While I was doing this, they found me purified in the temple without any crowd or tumult. But some Jews from Asia, they ought to be here before you and make an accusation should they have anything against me. Or let these men themselves say what wrongdoing they found when I stood before the council, other than this one thing that I cried out while standing among them. It is with respect to the resurrection of the dead that I am on trial before you today. Okay. So basically they say he stirs up riots. In fact, he was stirring up riots. He was desecrating the temple when we caught him. And he says, no, I'd hardly been in Jerusalem 2 weeks. And that's not even time enough to start any kind of rebellion. And when they found me, I was just minding my own business in the temple. So here you have these two stories. What do you even say when you're presented with these two points of view? But here's an interesting point. It says Felix, having a rather accurate knowledge of the way, put them off, saying, when Lysias the tribune comes down, I will decide your case. So this man knows something about his followers of Jesus. And he's going to put off having to commit himself until the tribune comes down. But in the meantime, he gives orders that Paul should be kept in custody, but given some liberty, and that no one should be prevented from attending to his needs. So basically, he is a guest under guard, not so much a prisoner. But the really funny thing about this is that he and his wife, his Jewish wife, sister of one of the Herods, to be honest, they send for Paul to hear him speak about the way. And Paul does not need to be asked twice. Paul reasons with them about righteousness and self-control in the coming judgment. And to a Roman, self-control, unless you're of a certain philosophical mindset, self-control is just not the thing. And as for judgment, the gods don't really judge, do they? I mean, they might get mad at you and wallop you if you step out of line, but there's no real judgment, is there? But he's so forceful about this, and he makes it so clear that the governor is alarmed and sends him away. He's like, go away, go away. I've heard enough. Thank you. Bye-bye. And yet, at the same time, he keeps hoping that he'll be bribed by Paul. And this was one of the things, according to some historians, that the Jews really hated the most about Felix, was that he was really interested in receiving bribes. But because of this weird situation, excuse me, he keeps sending for Paul to converse with him. Now, how many people would have a chance to repeatedly tell the gospel to someone in Felix's position? This is a really unique opportunity. And it's 2 years this happens until Felix is replaced by another governor, Festus. But since he wanted to leave on good terms, at least somewhat, with the Jews, he leaves Paul in prison. It is a long road to Rome, apparently. He spends 2 years imprisoned in the governor's residence in Caesarea. 2 years testifying to a man who was unreachable by any other means. But he's not in Rome yet, so we know there is more to come.